Bus Stop of Doom by Mark Newton. If, by some awful occurrence, your television suddenly bursts into flames, or quite simply there's nothing on the 176 channels you haven't already seen before, then I urge you to go on an adventure. An adventure that will not only take you outside, it will lead you to something so spectacular, outrageous, terrifying, and yet fascinating, it will change your life forever. If you dare, first you must hop on a bus, train, bicycle, plane or unicycle and travel to London. When in London, jump on the tube and travel the Northern Line until you get to Fenchurch Street Station. From there, catch the 4:30 bus to stop GA Old Brompton Road, and there you have reached your destination. If, on the other hand, you live in Spain and prefer to travel with the aid of giant birds, first you must find a bird with the correct migration path heading to Norway. Grip both hands firmly to the creature's legs and hold on tight for exactly 6 hours, 43 minutes and 35 seconds. Then let go and you'll find on landing yourself at stop GA Old Brompton Road. Alternatively, if you're one of the growing number of socially impaired human beings that have found their bottoms have become fused to a computer chair as a result of years spent surfing the net, playing on Minecraft, or making friends on Facebook with all the people you didn't want to be friends with at school, if you have evolved to the stage your chair extension has made it increasingly hard for you to leave the room, let alone venture into the great wide open, then enter street maps into Google. Type 200 Old Brompton Road, London into the search box, press enter, then zoom in as far as you can, and you will find yourself at stop GA Old Brompton Road. A bus stop. I know what you are thinking. It doesn't exactly sound like the adventure of a lifetime, and you'd be right. In fact, I do believe this is the first time anybody has written bus stop and adventure in the same sentence. As a rule, bus stops are practical structures, usually uninteresting and often quite dull. Well, except for the one in Billericay shaped like a giant apple. But this is no ordinary bus stop. No, this is the bus stop. Pause for dramatic effect. The bus stop of doom. Your adventure starts here. Read in the style of a wartime BBC newsreader. London, 17th of November, 1940, the Blitz. The city suffered sustained strategic bombing from Nazi Germany. Many buildings were destroyed, including famous landmarks and monuments. Over 200,000 soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Old Brompton Road was one of the many streets devastated by the bombing. It was hit, creating a huge crater, 40 feet across and 50 feet deep. If this had been the end of the story, it would have been horrible enough, but no, the impact of the bomb had not only blown the guts out of the city, it had woken the true horror that lay sleeping beneath Old Brompton Road. 7 years later, the 28th of October 1947, 5:30 a.m. The year 1947, Britain suffers one of the worst winters on record. Charlton Athletic beat Burnley 1-0 to win the FA Cup, India declared independence, and the first microwave was invented, and Kirk Douglas starred in Out of the Past. Victim number 1, Tony Withers. Tony Withers was a long, bony man, awkward in stature, but always pristinely clean and impeccably dressed. He had taken the 4:30 every day for the past 30 years. As a butcher in the Second World War, Tony had found it increasingly hard to supply his ever-dwindling customers with the fine quality meats they had grown accustomed to during more affluent times. Dedicated as he was, Tony always managed to provide a fresh, abundant range to raise the spirits and ease the purse strings of his remaining customers during this war-torn time. Tony stood at the bus stop. It was early, and as usual he stood alone waiting for the 4:30. If the unearthly hour and the reality of his miserable existence were not bad enough, there was a sudden clap of thunder, followed by rain so heavy Tony was soaked through in an instant. Tony lifted his head and allowed the rain to pummel his face. He realized that no matter how bad things were, they could always get worse. How right he was. Facing the rain and eyes firmly closed, Tony suddenly felt a strange warm sensation spread from his shin to his ankle. Dropping his head immediately, he saw a small dog urinating on his leg. In a burning fit of rage, Tony lunged at the dog. And then something happened no one could foresee. With a rumble like thunder and the shake of a tree, a whiff of some trouble had woken a beast. It had woken up hungry and ready to feast. With an ache in its stomach, the creature arose. As quick as a flash, a victim it chose. It leapt through the hedge and snatched the poor soul, and in less than a second, it swallowed him whole. Tony Withers was gone. All that remained was a pile of leaves and a small, slightly bewildered, scraggy dog. 14 years later, 5th of September 1961, 6:30 a.m. The year 1961. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin is the first man to travel into space. Tottenham Hotspur become the first English football team this century and only the third in history to win the double, the league title and the FA Cup. The Polaroid camera is introduced and Kirk Douglas stars in A Town Without Pity. Victim number 2, Ethel Roundbottom. Ethel Roundbottom was 85 years old and not, as her name might suggest, was quite thin and remarkably agile for her years, and for anyone else's years for that matter. Ethel caught the 4:30 every Monday, Wednesday and Friday to the Ministry of Defence, where she had worked as a tea lady for the past 50 years. It was widely known that as a young woman, Ethel was the first and last woman to receive the Victoria Cross for outstanding bravery. Ethel suffered severe burns whilst attempting to rescue 2 pilots from a stricken bomber. Despite her valiant efforts, both pilots perished in the blaze. Ethel's scars were a daily reminder of that fateful day. The sun was shining and all that queued waiting for the imminent arrival of the 4:30 looked almost happy to be there. The mood quickly changed. As to the middle of the queue joined a most unsavoury looking youth. He stood directly behind Ethel. The horrible urchin began to taunt the old lady. "God, what's that smell?" he blurted at maximum volume. "Smells like old granny to me." Ethel turned and glared at the uncouth youth. Her reaction only provoked another barrage of abuse. "Oh dear, she's not only very stinky, she's ugly too. She hasn't been hit by an ugly stick, more like an ugly log. Here, I've got a joke for you," he jeered. Addressing the others in the queue, "What's got skin like a crocodile, purple hair and smells like wee?" Everyone in the queue turned away, pretending there was something far more interesting happening somewhere else, hoping not to encourage the lout any further. "It's her!" he exclaimed, prodding a fat, dirty finger into the shoulder of poor Ethel. "Right, that's it," Ethel snapped. "I'll give you ugly stick," she bellowed as she raised her walking stick high in the air. The youth flinched, and all in the queue looked the other way. And then something happened no one could foresee. With a rumble like thunder and a shake of a tree, a whiff of some trouble had woken the beast. It had woken up hungry and ready to feast. With an ache in its stomach, the creature arose. As quick as a flash, a victim it chose. It leapt through the hedge and snatched the poor soul, and in less than a second it swallowed her whole. In that second, Ethel was gone, and in her place, just a large pile of leaves. 16 years later, the 6th of October, 1977. The Queen celebrated her Silver Jubilee. Liverpool dominated English and European football, winning both the European Cup and the Football League Championships, but they missed out on the treble by losing in the FA Cup final. Apple launched their first home computer. The Apple II goes on sale for a very affordable sum of £1,298. Kirk Douglas stars in Holocaust 2000. Victim number 3, Tabitha Kipling. Tabitha Kipling was round as she was tall. She had the physique of a bowling ball. Her face was red and spotty, and in the middle of her greedy mouth stood a lonely and quite rotten tooth. When she was 9 years old, Tabitha's entire family were killed in an avalanche whilst on a skiing holiday. Tabitha was spared death by her love of television and her disdain for exercise. Tabitha became heir to the family fortune and was made director of her father's cake factory, which as you can imagine had quite a detrimental effect on Tabitha's physical appearance. Tabitha stood at a bus stop, chocolate eclair in one hand and cream donut in the other. She knew there was only 5 minutes before the arrival of the 4:30, giving her a 5-minute window to devour both cakes. Due to her colossal size, Tabitha was often subject to cruel and judgmental comments. It would only leave her open to more ridicule if she was seen eating such an inappropriate breakfast. Just as she forced the last chunk of donut into her cream-covered face, the 4:30 arrived. Lifting her fat little leg as high as she could, Tabitha prized herself onto the first step of the bus. This was as far as she was going to get, as to her horror and the amusement of the other passengers, Tabitha's bottom became stuck firmly in the door of the 4:30. No matter how hard she pulled, she just couldn't free her giant-sized bottom. After a frustrating couple of minutes, which seemed like a day to Tabitha, the bus driver intervened. "If we can't get you on the bus," the driver groaned, "we're going to have to push you off." And with that, he ran at Tabitha with all of his might, closing his eyes at the point of impact. And then something happened no one could foresee. With a rumble like thunder and the shake of a tree, a whiff of some trouble had woken the beast. It had woken up hungry and ready to feast. With an ache in its stomach, the creature arose. As quick as a flash, a victim it chose. It leapt through the hedge and snatched the poor soul, and in less than a second it had swallowed her whole. The very confused bus driver found himself face down in a pile of leaves, and Tabitha was gone. 20 years later, the 22nd of May, 1997. The UK and the rest of the world mourn the death of Princess Diana. Arsenal overhauled Manchester United's lead during the final weeks of the season to win the Premiership title. They added the FA Cup 2 weeks later to become only the second English club to repeat the double. The domain name Google is registered, and Kirk Douglas stars as Harry in the movie Diamonds. Victim number 4, Professor Frederick Schmidt. Professor Schmidt was a brilliant scientist and inventor. Many of the professor's inventions had not only become household items that we use every day, but others have quite literally changed the face of the world in which we live. But as is common with those of brilliant minds, Schmidt spent most of his time in solitude. He had no family, and certainly no friends. The only time Frederick ventured out of his lab was to present a weekly lecture at the University of Science. Schmidt believed the greatest enemy of knowledge was knowledge not shared, and it was for this reason the professor forced himself to leave the solace of his lab and enter this very public arena. It was lecture day. Schmidt stood reluctantly waiting for the 4:30. The closeness of the others queuing made him feel very uncomfortable. The professor began to work out complicated equations to help shut his mind off from the reality of the moment.
"Excuse me, sir. Spare some change?"
Mid-equations, Schmidt opened one of his eyes and glanced down. There stood a very dirty young boy. He was covered in mud and bruises and smelt like the back end of a cow. "Spare change?" reported Schmidt. I don't have any spare change. All the money I have is designated for specific expenditure." "You what?" belched the boy. "All I want is a few quid, you old fool." "You're the fool," Schmidt barked back in rage. "If you got yourself a job, you wouldn't have to harass people at bus stops." Catching hold of the boy's arm, Schmidt continued his rant. "You can come with me. I'll give you a job and you can start earning your money." The boy immediately started to struggle with the professor. And then something happened no one could foresee. With a rumble like thunder and the shake of a tree, a whiff of some trouble had woken the beast. It had woken up hungry and ready to feast. With an ache in its stomach, the creature arose, and as quick as a flash, a victim it chose. It leapt through the hedge and snatched the poor soul, and in less than a second, it swallowed him whole. In the very blink of an eye, Schmidt was gone, and the young lad found himself lying on the pavement face down in a pile of leaves. Millions of years ago, the world was covered with a multitude of plants and trees. Many of the creatures that roamed this green land would have towered well above the 430. The survival of these colossal animals was dependent on their huge lungs having an abundant supply of thick, clean oxygen created by the world's lush vegetation. In the year 2000 BC, an asteroid collided with Earth, causing mass devastation. Forests burned, oceans flooded, leaving the land barren and the oxygen thin. The creatures that survived were forced into hibernation, waking to feed and then returning to rest, some sleeping for up to 20 years. The Ice Age came, and that brought the end to these mighty creatures. Or so we thought. During the Blitz of the 1940s, a man-made asteroid in the shape of a Nazi G-bomb landed on Old Brompton Road, waking the creature that lay dormant beneath the city for millions of years. The creature woke starving and needing to feed. Taking and consuming the victims was all this animal's starved lungs could manage. Once fed, the beast would slip back into hibernation until such time fresh blood would wake it from its slumber. Those that met their untimely demise to this mysterious and savage monster were victims, but not exactly innocent victims. The creature could smell evil and had carefully selected each meal. All the victims had one thing in common. They were all evil. Each had a terrible secret. A secret until now never told. Tony Withers, aka the Butcher of Bakersfield. When he was a small boy, Tony was bitten on the hand whilst tormenting a neighbour's dog. This event early in his life would have a profound effect on Tony's future. With age, his dislike for animals grew, especially his hatred for pets, mainly cats and dogs. It would make his blood boil that these creatures did nothing but take advantage of their owners, and such animals would terrorise his neighbourhood by leaving small brown and smelly parcels for unsuspecting passers-by to stand in. During the war, rations were so tight, it became increasingly difficult for Tony to provide meat for his customers. And then one fateful day, a scruffy dog entered the butcher's shop. It was in that second Tony had a terrible and gruesome idea. Before giving it a second thought, he had turned the mutt into sausages. In time, the butcher's sausages were the talk of the town. No sooner was a new batch made, a further supply was needed. It wasn't long before the neighbourhood pet supply was exhausted. Tony was forced to travel further afield for his ghastly ingredient. This he did for the duration of the war. It was only after his disappearance and the investigation of the Bakersfield shop, the true horror of the Butcher from Bakersfield, otherwise known as the Camden Cat Killer, and the Dog Dicer from Dartford, and many more, was revealed. Ethel Roundbottom, OAP, KGB. Ethel worked at the Ministry of Defence, but her true alliance was with the Russians, and she was noted to be one of their most deadly assassins. An expert in martial arts, Ethel was known as the Silent Sword. She would terminate her targets with a razor-sharp samurai sword hidden within a walking stick. During the Second World War, Ethel single-handedly brought down an RAF bomber. Both pilots were killed. Although Ethel's mission had been a success to the Russians, Ethel suffered 40% burns to her arms and her legs. After her recovery, the KGB reassigned Ethel to the Ministry of Defence. She continued to provide the Russians with top-secret data until her disappearance. Tabitha Kipling, an exceedingly bad girl. Tabitha was the only daughter of the world-famous baker Mr. Kipling. Mr. Kipling made exceedingly good cakes, and Tabitha possessed an unhealthy obsession with eating them. The Kiplings noticed their beloved daughter had started to balloon in size, so banned her from eating cakes and put her on a strict exercise regime. For 10 years, Tabitha suffered this diet from hell, until one day she finally snapped. During a family skiing holiday, whilst her parents were happily on the piste, Tabitha did the unthinkable. Not a fan of exercise, Tabitha sat at the bottom of the slope, wrapped in a full blanket resembling a giant fat Christmas turkey. Finishing her last pickled onion monster munch, she was about to throw the large grab bag packet to the ground. Tabitha thought a thought, and before she could rationalise this thought, she acted instantly. Tabitha took the bag, pressed her fat face to it and blew. inflating the packet, and then bang! Popped it. The sound, amplified by the shape of the valley, caused an avalanche, resulting in the death of both of her parents. As the only heir to the Kipling dynasty, Tabitha gorged herself on the family fortune until the day she disappeared. Professor Frederick Schmidt. Frederick was head of department at the University of Science in London. An old miser, Frederick hated paying anyone for anything, especially things he could make himself, even electricity. In the basement of Schmidt's 3-story Georgian townhouse were 2 large wheels, much like the ones you might find in a mouse cage. As much as Schmidt hated paying for anything, he utterly despised people who expected something for nothing. He considered the beggars on the streets to be nothing more than street rats. To provide enough power in the house every day, each of the large wheels must turn continuously for 12 hours. Just as the wheel in a mouse cage needs a mouse to turn it, Schmidt's wheels required a different kind of vermin to turn these mighty dynamos. With the promise of a shilling and a hot meal, the professor would lure unsuspecting beggar boys to the house, and there he would put them to work running in the huge wheels. The boys would run for weeks, and eventually they would die of exhaustion. The professor would dispose of their bodies and then head back into the murky London fog for more street rats. Many children met their untimely demise at the hand of Schmidt until his sudden disappearance. 15 years have passed since the demise of Frederick Schmidt, and apart from the occasional mugging, the bus stop has remained quiet. So, if by some strange occurrence your television has blown up, or there's simply nothing to watch on the 176 channels, then why not go on an adventure? The bus stop still stands at 200 Old Brompton Road, but beware, only embark on this journey if you are good, kind and pure of heart. If you hide an evil secret, you may be the next victim of the bus stop of doom.